The history of empire is usually written in gold and marble.
Yeah.
It's all about vast conquests, legendary sultans.
Mm.
But sometimes you have to look down at the bedrock.
Mm.
And what you find there can be incredibly dark. Our deep dive today is into, well, the lethal foundation of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
A brutal custom that became codified state law, the Law of Fratricide.
And, the political history of the early Ottoman dynasty, the House of Osman, it's really a study in ruthlessness married to necessity.
That's a good way to put it.
We look at the centuries of stability and the expansion the empire enjoyed, but that stability, it came at an immense and agonizing price. The ascension of a new sultan was rarely a moment of, unified joy.
No.
For every royal prince, it was often an immediate signal for state-sanctioned murder.
And that right there is the staggering premise we have to confront today. This wasn't just the byproduct of a few tyrannical rulers or, some arbitrary palace coup.
Not at all.
This was a legalized pillar of the imperial framework. It was seen by the highest authorities as absolutely essential. The goal wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. The goal was survival.
Exactly. The ultimate fear of the Ottoman state, what kept the rulers awake at night, it wasn't the Safavids to the east or the Habsburgs to the west.
It was the enemy within.
It was internal civil war, the devastating internecine strife that historically had brought down every powerful ruling house in the region. The path to the Gate of Felicity, the entrance to the Sultan's palace, it was quite literally paved with the bodies of the ruler's own kin.
All for the sake of political unity.
All sacrificed for that single goal.
So our sources today, they compel us to examine the mechanics of this.
Yeah.
We need to start with how this brutality was even legislated, how the religious elite provided a veneer of justification.
A very important veneer.
And of course, what the extreme human cost was before the entire system just buckled and was finally abandoned. We are exploring political pragmatism taken to its most horrific extreme.
And to really set the scene for this, maybe the best way to think about it is with an analogy. Imagine the structure of the Ottoman state is a massive, mission-critical computer network.
Okay, sprawling across continents, running all these complex systems.
Exactly. And the central operating system, the Sultanate itself, that is non-negotiable. It has to run perfectly without any interruption, or the entire state just crashes.
And that's the core vulnerability.
That's it. So to prevent the central system from crashing because of competing programs, and in this case, the competing programs are the many highly competent royal princes.
Right, they're all trying to run the same command at once.
Precisely. So the Ottoman political structure designed this ruthless, highly efficient firewall. The system was programmed to automatically delete every other copy of the operating software the moment the primary one was installed and booted up.
A self-cleansing system. It ensures the network never freezes or fragments because of a civil war of data.
But the trade-off was permanent. It required the constant destruction of its own most valuable backups.
Skilled, trained, adult male heirs.
The very people who could step in. That efficiency, it secured stability in the short term, but as we're going to see, it ultimately degraded the genetic and political resilience of the dynasty itself.
Okay, so let's start at the source. This wasn't just some custom that existed in the shadows. It was formalized by one of the greatest figures in Ottoman history, Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror.
The man who took Constantinople in 1453.
An incredible achievement. So we know Mehmed didn't invent the custom, but how did he actually make it law?
He enshrined it in his legal code, the Kanun name. That literally means the Book of Laws. And this act, you have to understand, was a critical moment in Ottoman constitutional history. It confirms Mehmed II as this master institution builder right alongside his military genius.
So he took a bloody, sporadic act of ambition and just elevated it.
He elevated it to a foundation of imperial governance, yes.
Now, I understand the Ottoman legal framework was complex. It rested on two pillars. Can you sort of walk us through where the Kanun name fit into that structure?
Certainly. So Ottoman legal tradition, it operated on two main levels. First, you have Shariat, or Islamic law. This is derived directly from the Quran, the Prophet's traditions, and classical jurisprudence.
And this was seen as divine, unchangeable.
Unchangeable. But the empire, being so vast, required an administrative and public order code that addressed issues where Shariat offered no direct guidance. Things like taxes, land tenure, feudal arrangements.
And critically, administrative stability.
The most critical thing of all. And that's where the Sultan's power came in.
This is Kanun,
Exactly. That need was filled by Urfi hukuk, or customary law, which is often just called kanun. These were imperial edicts, decrees, or firmans issued by the Sultan himself.
And the rule was that Kanan couldn't contradict Chariot.
It couldn't, but it could fill in the legal gaps necessary for running a massive multi-ethnic empire. And Mehmed II placed the law of fratricide firmly within this realm of customary law. It was a measure he saw as absolutely essential for the maintenance of state order.
And the exact wording of this decree, I mean, it must have been just chillingly direct.
It's uncompromising. There's no ambiguity. Mehmed's law explicitly states that whichever son was favored by God to become sultan.
Favored by God. That's key.
Very key. It gives it that divine sanction. It says he should, for securing the peace of the world, order his brothers to be executed.
Wow. So notice the phrasing there. It's not just permission. It's framed as a directive, a duty.
It is a directive, and it's based on the highest possible state rationale, securing the stability and order of the world, or nizam alam. The stability of the Ottoman Empire was viewed as the stability of the known world, and this law was the ultimate guarantee of that order.
The theological aspect here is just mind-boggling. How on earth did the religious establishment, the ulema, the Islamic scholars and jurists, how did they lend their authority to what is effectively a law of murder?
Right.
How do they reconcile this with Islamic principles?
This is where the theological maneuver becomes absolutely central to understanding the policy's success.
Right.
The ulema, they were highly pragmatic political actors.
I had to be.
They understood that internal strife, civil war among claimants to the throne, was a direct path to the devastation of the entire Muslim community. It meant the fracturing of the state and ultimately the triumph of external enemies. So they agreed that fratricide was a necessary evil.
A price worth paying.
The lesser of two evils required to prevent widespread bloodshed.
So they needed a scriptural justification for this necessity. Where did they find it?
They found it in a highly accommodating yet politically brilliant reinterpretation of a Quranic verse. It's from Surah 2.
Okay.
The verse states that sedition, or fitna, is worse than execution. Or, more literally, it's worse than killing or slaughter.
Now, originally that verse related to fighting during the sacred months or, religious dissension, didn't it? It wasn't about politics.
It was not. In classical Islamic jurisprudence, fitna often referred to apostasy, to turning people away from the true religion or spiritual discord. The Ottoman jurists stretched. They stretched the definition of fitna to encompass political sedition.
So a dynastic civil war becomes the ultimate fitna.
The ultimate form of it. By framing the murder of a few princes, this single heir elimination policy, as preventing the mass sedition, the discord, and the generalized bloodshed that comes with the civil war, they transformed the execution of kin into a public order measure.
So instead of being seen as an act against God's law, it becomes an act in defense of the Muslim community and the state's integrity. Killing one or two potential claimants now is justified because it prevents the killing of thousands later.
Precisely. It was a cold, pragmatic cost-benefit analysis, and it was endorsed by the highest religious authorities in the land. They leveraged the immense fear of political chaos, which was still a very fresh memory in the minds of the people.
So this theological argument provided the necessary religious and moral safety net for the Sultan.
It did. It allowed him to enforce the law without facing internal challenges to his legitimacy based on Shariat.
And we know this argument wasn't just invented by Mehmed II. It had a powerful precedent.
Yes, the practice existed earlier, which proves the justification was always sort of ready to deploy when needed. After the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when Sultan Murad I was assassinated.
On the battlefield.
On the battlefield, his son Bayezid I immediately had his brother Yaqub strangled with a bowstring, right there and then. And the sources confirm that theologians immediately justified that specific act using a similar Quranic verse about preventing sedition.
So Mehmed II simply took this high-stakes, successful precedent and made it permanent.
He institutionalized it. He took the elimination of an adult rival, backed by his own troops, and made it the rule for the entire dynasty. It was the ultimate concentration of lethal power in the central authority.
And by codifying it in the Kanun name, Mehmed II solidified that central authority, making the Sultan the supreme military commander, the theoretical owner of all land, and the chief executor of this terrifying law, the law that guaranteed singular rule.
Once that rule of fratricide was established, it dictated the entire life trajectory of every royal son for the next 2 centuries. And this was not a soft existence within the palace walls. The succession was truly a brutal, violent contest that ensured only the most capable, or frankly, the luckiest, survived.
This era is correctly called the survival of the fittest, because the competition wasn't among pampered nobles in a drawing room, it was between hardened military commanders. So describe this compulsory warrior training the princes received.
It was intensive. It was state-mandated on-the-job training. Every male heir or shahzad was dispatched to govern a provincial post, a sanjak. They were sent with their entire household, their mother, their tutors, a small military detachment.
So the prince is acting as the governor, the Sanjak Bey.
Exactly.
He's responsible for everything.
Everything. Statecraft, justice, tax collection, and most importantly, military command. This was the Ottoman equivalent of a military college, but with real-world life-or-death stakes.
They were running miniature courts and miniature states, essentially.
Absolutely. And their performance was monitored very closely by the Sultan back in the capital. They learned how to lead in battle, how to command large contingents of the imperial army. We see examples like the Battle of Baskent in 1473,
Right.
where Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror deployed his own sons, Bayezid and Mustafa, each commanding major flanks of the army. They were not figureheads. They were hardened, politically astute generals.
But wait, doesn't this preparation completely undermine the stability the Sultan was trying to ensure? By turning his sons into these experienced, competent military commanders, he's creating the perfect recipe for a civil war the minute he dies.
That is the great paradox of the entire system.
It seems counterintuitive.
It is. The training ensured the Sultan's successor would be competent, which is a critical trait for a warrior state, but it guaranteed that the succession process itself would be violent. The Sultan had to implement these subtle checks to kind of delay or limit their power while he was still alive.
Such as restricting public symbols of their power.
Yes, that was a big one. For example, they were often denied the right to grow a full beard.
A symbol of adulthood.
A potent symbol of adulthood, maturity, and authority in Ottoman society. And more importantly, they were restricted from sponsoring major public works, mosques, hospitals, colleges, in their own names.
So no legacy building.
Exactly. Those public symbols of power were reserved for the central imperial authority in Istanbul. This was a constant, visible reminder to the prince and his entire court that his authority was temporary and derivative. It came from the Sultan.
But the moment the Sultan died, all those limitations just vanished. The provincial governors, hardened by years of rule, commanding loyal troops, having access to local treasuries, they were ready to mobilize instantly.
The race was immediate and total. News of the Sultan's death was often a tightly held secret, but once it broke, the princes and their networks scrambled. They engaged in a literal, violent dash to reach the capital, seize the imperial treasury, and claim the throne.
And this rush was crucial because the first one to get to Istanbul.
The first one to get there and receive the oath of allegiance, especially from the Janissaries, was typically considered the legitimate successor. Possession was 9/10 of the law.
And we understand this entire law was a direct response to the devastating chaos of the Ottoman Interregnum. That period proved exactly what happens when you have multiple, highly competent heirs who are allowed to live and fight simultaneously.
That is the key historical context. You have to remember, 1402, Sultan Bayezid I is defeated and captured by the Turco-Mongol conqueror Timur at the Battle of Ankara. And this wasn't just a military defeat, it was a total state collapse.
The Sultan himself in a cage.
In a cage. And Bayezid's sons, Musa, Isa, Mehmed, and Suleiman, they fought for a grueling decade for total control of the fractured remnants of the empire.
And the consequence of that decade-long fight.
It was catastrophic. The entire empire fractured, regions declared independence, it nearly collapsed entirely.
Yeah.
It was this memory, this folk memory of total anarchy of the Muslim community turned against itself that solidified the consensus. Eliminating rivals immediately, no matter how brutal, was preferable to 10 years of unending civil war.
Mehmed II, who wrote the law, would have grown up with stories of this chaos.
Absolutely. He was acutely aware that the existence of multiple experienced contenders meant certain disaster for the centralized state he was trying to build.
To really feel the intensity of the system, I think we have to look at the family tragedy of Suleiman the Magnificent. He is the very definition of a Golden Age ruler, yet his own house was just consumed by this lethal uncertainty.
Suleiman's reign, which spans the mid-16th century, it showcases the system at its most politically manipulative. The primary conflict was between the immensely popular Prince Mustafa, who was the eldest, and his younger half-brothers,
The sons of Hurrem Sultan.
the sons of the powerful Hurrem Sultan, yes.
So why was Mustafa's popularity so dangerous? Specifically, his popularity with the Janissaries.
Because the Janissaries were the kingmakers. Their loyalty or their lacking loyalty could instantly turn the scales in any succession struggle. This tendency had started early, with Selim I, who effectively seized power from his own father, Bayezid II, because he had Janissary support.
And Mustafa was beloved by them.
He was. The Janissary Corps adored him, and in a climate of intense paranoia, Suleiman feared that the troops might just bypass his authority and install Mustafa prematurely. The fear was deposition, not just competition after his death.
And this fear was exploited by an incredibly sophisticated political coalition within the palace.
It was a perfect alignment of self-preservation. This coalition consisted of Mustafa's stepmother, Hurrem Sultan, her daughter, Mirma Sultan, and Mirma's very influential husband, the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha.
And their motivation was simple survival.
Completely. If Mustafa won the throne, the Law of Fratricide mandated the execution of Hurrem's sons, Bayezid and Selim. To survive, they had to ensure Mustafa's execution first. So they used their immense access, their wealth, their network, to convince Suleiman that Mustafa was plotting treason.
And Mustafa was executed in 1553, famously strangled in his father's tent while on campaign.
Yes, and this event profoundly affected the public consciousness. Contemporary Ottoman historians, people like Mustafa Ali, they viewed this execution as deeply illegitimate. They blamed his death openly on the plotting of women and the deceit of the dishonest son-in-law.
So for them, this was a sign of decline.
For them, the manipulation by these palace factions signaled a victory of internal corruption over merit. It marked the start of a perceived decline, even if the empire was still, militarily robust on the outside.
And the bloodshed didn't even stop with Mustafa. Suleiman's house was cleansed further when Bayezid, Hurrem's surviving son, rebelled against his brother Selim.
Bayezid realized he couldn't just wait for his brother to become sultan and then kill him. He mounted a full rebellion, was defeated by the imperial army, and then he made the fatal error of fleeing to the rival Safavid Empire in Persia.
A terrible mistake.
A fatal one. Suleiman, determined to secure the succession for Selim II, negotiated furiously. The Safavid Shah ultimately agreed, in exchange for vast sums of gold, to hand Bayezid and his 4 young sons over to Turkish executioners.
So the magnificent Sultan, the great lawgiver, authorizes the murder of his own son and his 4 grandsons on foreign soil.
It secured singular power for Selim II, who took the throne 5 years later as the sole legitimate adult heir. The system, codified to ensure unity, worked precisely as intended. It eliminated all military and political rivals, but it required the Sultan to commit these extreme acts of violence and political maneuvering that fundamentally stained his legacy and demonstrated the enormous systemic brutality of the law. In a world where a prince's political fate was sealed either by the throne or by the bowstring, a prince's most devoted and frankly most necessary ally was his mother.
The imperial harem. Far from being just a place of pleasure, it was a vital political institution, the primary training ground for this lethal political maneuvering.
Absolutely. The mother, the concubine mother, or the Haseki, was effectively the custodian of her son's sovereignty. Her entire existence was defined by his success or failure.
And she would go with him to the provinces.
That is the essential truth of her position. Once her son was assigned to a provincial post, she was officially known as the mother of the prince, and she accompanied him. Her life was entirely dedicated to guarding him, to acting as his political anchor, and instructing him on statecraft.
The sources say she was expected to exercise great diligence.
Great diligence, yes. To guard her son from plots, from poisoning, and from any form of misconduct that might draw the Sultan's deadly attention back in the capital.
It sounds like a constant, debilitating state of paranoia. And what was the consequence if she failed, if her son lost?
The penalty for failure was total destitution and exile, though it was usually honorably conducted. If her son lost the race for the throne and was executed strangled with the bowstring, which was a non-bloody death reserved for royalty, the mother faced honorable exile.
We saw this with Mahidevran, Mustafa's mother.
A perfect example. After her son's death, Mahidevran Khatun was exiled to the former capital of Bursa, stripped of her wealth, her influence, dependent on others just for survival. The loss of her son meant the end of her status, her power, and all of her security.
So given that the prince was constantly moving and governing out in the provinces, how exactly did his mother act as his political agent? Why couldn't the prince just rely on his male retinue?
Because the prince was surrounded by people with divided loyalties. His tutors, his lalas, were appointed by the sultan.
Not by him.
Not by him. They were paid by the central treasury, and they reported back to Istanbul. Their ultimate loyalty lay with the central authority and the reigning sultan, not the prince they were supposedly mentoring.
So if the prince's political prospects started to dim, or if he showed any signs of treason,
The lala was highly liable to betray him to secure his own position. It was simple self-preservation.
the vulnerability of the prince must have been immense then, knowing his closest advisors could turn on him at any moment.
Yeah.
We saw this vulnerability with Prince Jem, who was deserted by his powerful Lala, Gedik Ahmed Pasha.
He was. Yedik Ahmed Pasha switched allegiance to the victorious Bayezid, and that systemic vulnerability made the mother absolutely indispensable. She used her wealth, her status, her intimate court connections, the informants, the former palace slaves, the eunuchs, to build these essential shadow networks of support in the capital and among the military.
So she was the prince's eyes and ears back in Istanbul.
Constantly verifying the loyalty of his entourage and informing him of the shifting political winds.
That makes perfect sense. The mother was the only person with a truly zero-sum stake in the prince's success. She was the only guaranteed loyalist in his entire circle.
And this political savvy is actually documented in the sources. Take the example of Guru Khatun, the mother of Prince Alemsha. She actively intervened in her son's affairs.
How so?
Well, when her son was deemed to be misbehaving in his province, she wrote directly to Sultan Bayezid II, demanding the removal of her son's entourage. She blamed the misconduct on his advisors, thereby protecting her son and herself from the Sultan's direct wrath.
That's incredibly shrewd.
It demonstrates her constant dual role, guardian of her son's person and a shrewd political manager of his reputation in the capital.
And this political reality, it sets the stage for the absolute apex of female political power in the empire. The Vali Sultan, the Sultan's mother.
The Valid Sultan was not just the figurehead. She held supreme power over the harem and was explicitly recognized as the custodian of imperial power. Her responsibilities were immense. She trained the ruler, she supervised his education, and critically, she ensured the dynasty's reproduction and continuation.
So she had access to sensitive state information, she managed key appointments.
She often acted as a conduit between the Grand Vizierate and the sequestered sultan. The depth of their political knowledge must have been encyclopedic, given that they spent decades navigating that Byzantine court environment.
Absolutely essential.
And these women, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, the period we now know as the Sultanate of Women, they consolidated power through strategic alliances. They would often marry their daughters, the Sultan's sisters, to leading statesmen, thereby securing powerful military and administrative sons-in-law.
The Damids.
The Dons. And figures like Kozum Sultan, one of the most powerful women in world history, demonstrated that female agency could become the primary force of stability and sometimes instability when the male dynastic line was compromised.
She actually sanctioned the deposition of her own sons at times, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. And this shows the ultimate pragmatism. These women acted for the survival of the dynasty. By eliminating the legitimate male challengers through fratricide and later confinement, the sultans inadvertently created a political vacuum that powerful, highly competent women had to fill to ensure the state did not collapse. Their power became the necessary counterweight to the often insecure authority of the reigning monarch.
For over a century and a half, the Law of Fratricide achieved its primary goal: stability and unity. But the sheer, cold-blooded brutality of the policy inevitably pushed against the limits of what the populace could accept. It culminated in moments of unparalleled horror that eventually created an existential risk for the dynasty itself.
The tradition of eliminating rivals had been maintained through the 16th century, but by the reign of Murad III, the practice had become politically toxic. We have to zero in on his accession in 1574 because that moment was the turning point where the political necessity of the law utterly collided with public morality.
Murad III ordered the execution of his 19 younger brothers upon taking the throne. The scale alone is shocking, but the victims themselves. Many were infants or young boys.
And that is what made the event so traumatic and so public. Earlier fratricides usually involved adult rivals out in the provinces. But in 1574, these executions were performed in Istanbul, the permanent capital. The accounts are just devastating.
I read one account of the aftermath. the sight of 19 coffins, some reportedly doll-sized, being carried out of the palace simultaneously.
The sources confirm the unprecedented public trauma. The populace of Istanbul was overwhelmed with sorrow. One account notes that a crowd of mourners gathered for the funeral of those 19 princes that was twice the size of the crowd that attended the funeral of the previous sultan.
Wow.
The sight of the innocent being sacrificed for political order was just becoming unbearable.
It transforms a political necessity into sanctioned infanticide. And the source you mentioned, the one detailing the pleas of the eldest, Prince Mahmud, it just paints a horrific picture.
It does. Mahmud, who's described as a beautiful and beloved youth, he knew his fate. The account details him pleading with his older brother, the new sultan. He said, "My lord and brother, you are the sultan, and may Allah give you a long life, but I have committed no sin. Let not my days be ended thus, in this my tender age."
And he was strangled nonetheless.
He was. These were not rival generals anymore. They were children, executed to secure the throne, making the practice increasingly anachronistic and deeply unpopular.
Beyond the moral crisis, the practice began to pose an enormous dynastic risk, didn't it?
Absolutely. The system became its own worst enemy. The high rates of infant mortality common at the time, combined with the policy of executing every potential male relative, meant the royal line was constantly razor-thin.
So if the sultan died young or failed to produce a surviving male heir,
A massive possibility.
the entire House of Osman could be extinguished. The whole state, built over centuries, just gone.
This fear must have been palpable, and the decisive moment came with Ahmed I. He ascended the throne in 1603, and he did not execute his younger brother Mustafa.
A radical break.
A radical break from a 150-year-old law. And sources suggest he was motivated by two factors: this recent history of dynastic risk and the compelling political influence of his mother, Kosem Sultan.
Kosem Sultan, again, the political agent. What was her calculation here?
Kosem was looking ahead. She argued that since Ahmed himself was not the firstborn, but had come to the throne through providence, he should show mercy to Mustafa. Her ultimate goal was the preservation of her own line.
A calculated gamble.
It was. If Ahmed showed mercy, she hoped that a future sultan, perhaps Ahmed's son, would in turn show mercy to her other sons, who might be Mustafa's potential rivals. It was a calculated gamble for multi-generational protection.
The system was fracturing under the weight of its own brutality and its own risk. So in 1617, the legal framework had to shift completely.
In 1617, the law of succession officially changed. It went from the brutal meritocratic survival of the fittest to agnatic seniority, or ekbariat.
Which meant?
It meant the throne would pass to the oldest living male member of the House of Osman, be he a brother, an uncle, or a cousin. And this was the institutional end of the Law of Fratricide.
But if they were so focused on stability, why didn't they just introduce primogeniture, the right of the firstborn son, which was standard in Europe? Why risk the political vacuum caused by confining these untrained adult relatives?
That is the critical question, and primogeniture was rejected because it often led to child rulers. Minors who could not command the army or enforce the law, opening the door to regents and power struggles. The Ottomans needed an adult, competent ruler instantly available.
But they still viewed all rival heirs as lethal threats, so they replaced the executioner's bowstring with confinement. And that's the birth of the Kafes system, the golden cage.
Precisely. The new system confined the non-reigning princes, the Shahzads, permanently to secluded apartments within the palace walls, the Kafes. And they were intentionally stripped of all their warrior training, all their administrative experience, all their military contacts.
And to ensure no competing dynastic lines could emerge, the rules around reproduction were stark.
Yes. Critically, princes consigned to the Kafes were often not allowed to father children until they actually ascended the throne. This was to prevent a political faction from raising an alternative heir from the Kafes, thus eliminating the possibility of a rival claim after the death of the reigning sultan.
They literally disappeared behind the harem walls.
For decades, sometimes emerging completely unprepared if they ever became sultan.
So the immediate succession wars were eliminated, which secured stability. But the long-term consequence was the rise of deeply inexperienced and often mentally unstable rulers. It's an incredible trade-off.
It was a disastrous trade-off for competence. The empire gained dynastic continuity, but it sacrificed leadership quality. Princes who emerged from the Kafes after 20, 30, or even 40 years of confinement were often, in the words of later critics, incompetents, degenerates, and misfits. They were emotionally and politically crippled.
The most tragic example of this incompetence has to be Sultan Ibrahim, who succeeded his brother Murad IV in 1640.
Ibrahim is the perfect, terrifying case study. He had spent his entire life, 33 years, confined in the royal harem, living in constant daily fear of execution.
Unimaginable.
When he was told he was sultan, he initially refused to leave the Kafes. He thought it was a trick by his brother to lure him out and kill him. His psychological state was fragile, bordering on madness. He was completely deprived of any statecraft training.
The state, which had been built on the charisma and the military competence of warrior sultans like Mehmed II and Suleiman, now depended on a man utterly unprepared to rule a multi-continental empire.
He was entirely dependent on the Grand Viziers and, crucially, on his mother, Kosum Sultan, to actually run the government. Ibrahim was eventually deposed and executed in 1648, demonstrating that while the Kafes eliminated sibling rivalry, it introduced massive instability through sheer incompetence. The absolute authority the sultans had fought so brutally to preserve was ironically hollowed out by the very system designed to protect it. To fully grasp this system, we really have to connect it back to the broader Ottoman institutional logic. Fratricide and the Kafes were these ultimate measures designed to secure a governing structure that was built on absolute loyalty. It rejected any rival centers of power.
And that search for absolute loyalty led to the institutional preference for the slave elite, the ones generated by the Devshirme system.
The Devshirme, or the collection system, it recruited Christian boys from European provinces, converted them, and trained them to be personally obedient servants of the Sultan. The fundamental principle was that the Sultan owned his servants. They had no competing loyalties to land, to family, or to aristocratic Turkish traditions.
A meritocratic system.
A meritocratic system that provided the empire with a loyal, disciplined elite. These were the men who filled the highest ranks: the janissaries, the grand viziers, the governors.
Precisely. After Mehmed II had early trouble with powerful Turkish aristocratic families, like the execution of the influential Grand Vizier Chandarlı Halil Pasha, the sultans deliberately preferred this slave administration. They were much easier to control compared to free administrators of Turkish extraction who might challenge the central authority.
This brings us back to the janissaries, the elite infantry born from this very system. They were initially the backbone of loyalty, but they became the kingmakers in the succession struggles, the very force that Prince Mustafa was so popular with.
Right. In the classical age, the janissaries were a loyal war machine. But post-Suleiman, they began to realize their immense political leverage.
If they could place a sultan on the throne, they could also demand favors. We see them demanding higher wages, like in the 1449 revolt, and successfully pressuring the sultan to relax core rules, notably allowing them to marry in 1566.
Which changed everything. Allowing them to marry and create families meant they evolved from a solely loyal fighting unit into a self-interested, hereditary caste with local roots and local political agendas.
It broke the original pact.
The pact of sole loyalty to the Sultan was gone.
It was a fundamental institutional shift. The janissaries became resistant to military modernization and reform, turning the original mechanism of the state's power into its greatest liability. Their capacity to depose sultans became a central problem. They could force a sultan to implement or repeal policy, effectively challenging the absolute authority the state had preserved through fratricide.
So if fratricide was the ultimate method for the Sultan to enforce unitary rule over his dynastic rivals, then the eventual violent abolition of the janissaries, the auspicious incident of 1826, was the ultimate, albeit centuries later, attempt by the Sultan to enforce that same unitary authority over the military institution he himself had created.
That is the essential symmetry of Ottoman institutional violence. Fratricide, the Kafes, and the massacre of the janissaries were all radical, desperate maneuvers intended to protect the concept of the absolute, centralized sovereignty of the Sultan and the unity of the empire from fragmentation caused by competing internal centers of power.
Whether those centers were rival brothers or an overly powerful military caste.
The state's longevity was repeatedly secured only through the systematic, total application of lethal force against internal threats.
When we look back at everything we've covered, the policy of state-sanctioned fratricide was, in the end, a cold, pragmatic political calculation that achieved its stated objective.
It did.
It successfully prevented the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire into small, squabbling feudal states. It ensured centralized political unity for centuries.
It was longevity purchased at the highest possible price. The empire was literally built on the sacrifice of its own children. The practice left this indelible legacy, a cycle of maternal grief, public horror, and eventually the political dysfunction of the Kafes system.
Which traded warrior princes for incompetent, Sheltered sovereigns.
They secured the dynasty, but they hollowed out the essential competence of the ruling house itself.
It really makes you question where the true center of power lay in this seemingly absolute system.
And that raises the final provocative thought we want to leave with you. In the classical Ottoman system, the greatest check on the Sultan's absolutism was never a constitution, it was never a powerful parliament. It was simply the physical existence of a politically competent brother or son.
A rival heir, trained in statecraft and backed by troops.
The one thing Mehmed II's Law of Fratricide was specifically designed to eliminate. That was the check.
But the elimination of that check, first by execution and later by the isolation of the Kafes, it didn't actually secure absolute power for the Sultan.
No, it created a political vacuum at the top. By systematically removing the only legitimate male dynastic competitors, the Sultans inadvertently caused the institutional rise of powerful non-dynastic figures,
The Grand Viziers
who often acted as de facto heads of state,
and the Valid Sultans.
the queen mothers, who became the true operational heads of the central administration. The dynasty secured the monarch's person from execution, but it simultaneously proved that absolute, centralized authority was impossible to maintain. Regardless of the law of murder, there was always another competing center of power, whether military, bureaucratic, or maternal, waiting in the wings to ensure the state survived, even if the Sultan himself failed to rule.